Today on Blue Values TV, genetically modified organisms and genetically engineered foods. Welcome to part one of our two-part story on this. Stay tuned. Welcome to Blue Values TV, a production of the Blue Values Coalition. The Blue Values Coalition is a nonprofit organization dedicated to informing, educating, and engaging our neighbors in the governance of our communities. Look for us online at bluevaluescoalition.org. Our guest today is Kathleen Furey, and she's an activist with movements to label genetically engineered foods. We're going to talk about genetically engineered foods and genetically modified organisms, otherwise known as GMOs. Kathleen, it's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thanks, Jack. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. Can you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background, and how did you get into this marvelous stuff that you're doing?
Well, I came from a big family, and we cooked a big meal every night. I went shopping with my mom for the food and helped her cook the food, and she would teach me how to read labels. And she'd say, what's the difference between this rice and that rice? And I'd say, the package? I don't know, what is it? And she'd say, well, rice is rice, isn't it? But that's kind of where it started. And then I went back to Stony Brook University for a sustainability studies degree program that they were offering. It was one of only two in the country that was being offered for a degree. And I did a paper, among other papers, on power, city planning, civilizations in collapse, all these different environmental issues. I did one on food, and I just wanted to get a sense of where is our food at. I know there's organic food, there's this non-organic food. What's going on with all this? And that report just kind of blew my mind. And my professor's mind, and everybody in my class's minds too, when I did the presentation for them about what was going on with the food supply, which brought into my realm genetically modified foods, genetically engineered foods. And so I've been researching and working on getting education out to people about what the foods are about ever since.
Sounds fantastic. Now, let's start out by asking a simple question. What are we talking about when we talk about genetically engineered foods and GMOs? How would you define those?
Well, in the United States, we call GMOs genetically modified organisms, and genetic engineering. We kind of use those terms synonymously.
Yeah.
They sort of interchangeably. But what genetic modification has actually happened since almost the beginning of domesticated foods, crops and animals, where somebody will say, hey, I've got a really strong cotton plant that seems to be doing well under the drought. Or this animal's really bigger than the others in its group of animals that just got bred. So why don't we see if we can breed these so that we could produce more of these stronger animal species. So with modification, the genetic engineering, it's a little different because we're not taking animals within the same species or crops within the same species. We're actually taking the DNA and we're taking the genes of one species and we're inserting by force that DNA into the genes of that into an unrelated species. The DNA of an unrelated species, which can't be done without human intervention. The reasons it was done had to do with drought, had to do with resistance to pests, resistance to weeds, which is certainly good reasoning. But we found that there's been problems with bacterium that's been introduced, viruses, E. coli, different things that are introduced that may not be, they may be possibly unsafe creating health and environmental problems.
Yeah, the genes that have been introduced in some cases have come from caterpillars or bacteria or other sources.
They've even, I think I've heard the example of a spider gene
Uh-huh.
getting inserted into a pig so that I don't know, it just, they're
can be
just
a weird combination.
very strange combinations. That's not the kind of stuff that we're eating right now, but those are
Right.
some crazy things. And the earliest one was the flavor saver tomato, which was some genes from a fish were inserted into the tomato DNA because they thought, wow, the fish, this particular characteristic that we're trying to bring into the tomato would allow us to take these tomatoes across country for many, couple days or so, or many miles, without getting disturbed in the refrigerated trucks,
Right.
and they could stay fresh and healthy. But the product wasn't successful, and it failed on the market. But that was one of the very first. I think it was the first example. So that's a tomato into a fish into a tomato. I don't care how much wine you give them or Barry White music, they're not going to normally mate, you know what I'm saying? They're not going to make babies, but they were doing that.
It certainly sounds very bizarre until you
It
think
is
about,
crazy.
until you think that 80-90% of the DNA that we have in our bodies is actually in common with most plants and animals to begin with anyhow. And so as
True.
I understand it, what scientists are doing is trying to take certain genes that encode for certain proteins that offer certain benefits, such as disease resistance or drought tolerance, and
Right.
insert those in. So the effect of taking a gene into a different species is usually to get that other species to produce a particular protein or set of proteins that result in a particular property, such as tolerance to weed killer and so on. So the question is, if all they're doing is basically producing these different proteins that get digested upon eating, what's the danger in genetically engineered foods?
Well, I think part of the danger is that they're not safety tested before they're put on the market. So we were told that there's, hundreds of studies that have been done to safety test these before they've been put on the market, but that's not actually accurate. The safety testing is inadequate. The FDA itself allows the manufacturer to provide them with their own, whatever they've done for their testing, and to tell them that we think this is safe, and then the FDA says, well, if you say it's safe, then we will put it on the market, we'll approve it. But it's not adequate. I mean, we really need to see that we need to apply the precautionary principle, which means first we find out if there's any reason that this is unsafe or any reason that it's toxic, and then once that's proven not to be toxic and not to be unsafe, not to cause health or environmental damage, then we can approve it. But we've actually bypassed that step, and we've let the people that make the products do their own testing without independent peer-reviewed researching, which has been a big part of the problem.
There are other places that we let companies, pharmaceuticals comes to mind, where the companies will do their own testing and then it gets reviewed by the FDA. Are you saying that the FDA is not adequately reviewing the testing that does get done by the
No,
companies?
they're not reviewing it. They're just saying if you're telling us this is safe, then we're going with what you're telling us. And
Basically, they rely on the conclusion from the study itself, from the companies.
whatever they've provided, saying that it's, they're claiming that it's safe, yeah.
So is
but
the
they're not
problem-
doing independent peer-reviewed. In other words, they're not allowing a peer-reviewed independent research to be done so that the public has access to what's happened in the research, and they can make a decision about, well, if these are some of the results, we think this should be tested further, we think this should be revised, we think there should be changes, but we don't get that chance to do that.
Right. So is the problem really with the food itself, or is it with inadequate testing? And would it be possible to strengthen the testing to basically demonstrate the safety of these foods? Should the focus be on really eliminating these genetically engineered foods or labeling them, or should it be on improved testing to make sure that they are safe?
I don't really know about the first part of it, whether they should be eliminated completely, because it's really not, that's not really the thing I'm concerned about at this moment. It's more that we should be able to identify these products, since we haven't been able to identify them. 64 countries already label genetically engineered foods. They either label them, restrict them, or ban them. France just actually, I think yesterday or today, finalized their ban on genetically engineered maize, planting it, but we don't have that kind of ability to identify those products in our stores. And most of these products, most of the genetically engineered, particularly the crops, are used for biofuel, livestock feed, and a small percentage, well, a smaller percentage, about a third, go to processed foods.
Right.
So if you kind of buy things in a bag, bottle, box, or can, chances are something's genetically engineered in that in general, because so there's a lot of ability for them if they want to process it with the corn starch, with the different hydrogenated, whatever, a lot of different processes that will be in the processed foods required that they use the genetically engineered crops as their sourcing. So a lot of the companies have decided to source from non-GMO sourcing, and they put that on the label, which is the non-GMO project label. And then the organics can only allow up to less than 1% of the crop or the product to be genetically engineered, because there's contamination of the of the organic crops now from pollen drift, seed drift.
The thing that I wanted to really bore in on the testing on is it possible to test these things adequately to ensure that they are safe? Is it at all possible, or is it just something that we can't even really attack?
Well, we have a law from 1958 that states we have to do this kind of testing. It's a food and cosmetic law, so food and drug cosmetic law. So we have.
But I'm not asking if we have a law. I'm asking, is it possible to adequately test foods to be safe?
Well, I'm not a biologist or a chemist, so I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. But if we have a law that says we need to do this testing prior to putting it on the market for people to put on their skin or in their hair or in their bodies to eat, then I think we should be figuring out what that testing what should be required in that testing, and then go about and do that testing, and then make the decision based on the results of the test to see whether this is harmful, whether it needs to be revised. But I think there should be very strenuous testing on anything that's put into our food, and anything put into our. We're finding out about all these parabens and things that are in our cosmetics now.
Right.
We know these things are very bad for us. A lot of things in the cosmetics that aren't being tested too.
I guess my point is that it's fairly easy to prove that a substance is dangerous, that it does pose a risk, that we see some negative effects from it. It's very difficult to prove that it's totally safe. In other words, there's always going to be, it's safe to X% probability. It might be 99%, it might be 99.99%, but there are always going to be people that are saying that, well, you haven't really proven this is totally safe. And so my question is, what does it take to really demonstrate that a genetically engineered food is safe? Does it require 99%, 99.99%? And is it ever going to be possible to convince skeptics of genetically engineered food that, no, these really are safe?
Well, I think testing, if we see testing that shows, we've already seen a number of scientists that have done tests on the genetically engineered potatoes, maize, what are some of the other ones? So the potatoes and the maize are two of the big ones, even though the potatoes aren't even genetically engineered anymore. That was an old test. There's a lot of studies that have been done that show there's problems with the animals that have been tested, but a lot of those scientists have been vilified. And so I don't really care who does the testing. Just show me the tests that are independent and peer-reviewed that can prove that this stuff is safe before it's put on the market. And that has not been done.
The problem is those words, prove that it's safe, is what I'm getting at, is how do you ever prove that something is safe?
I'm not a scientist, so I can't answer exactly how it's done, but scientists know. I mean, they have to be able to prove they have to be able to prove to some level of
probability.
safety that
Right.
it's, I mean, sugar is not safe. We're eating sugar
Right,
every day of our
exactly.
lives. You had a cookie. I mean, I'm sure I'll have some sugar later today
probably have a
myself.
second one, too.
Exactly. So, but sugar is actually poison.
Sure.
So we're eating poison all the time. How much of it are we eating? So we actually, Dr. Robert Lustig, you may know of him from San Francisco, UC San Francisco. He does lectures on sugars all the time, and he calls them sweet poisons. And he says, you know, we used to have sugar just when these fruits were ripe, and then the rest of the year we had sort of a
Sugar-free diet.
yeah, we had nothing in our supply that really allowed us to have the sweets. But now, because foods can be shipped all over the world, sugars are available all the time, so there's more abundance of them, and they're cheaper, a lot of cheaper ones that they're making. So, but we're really not supposed to eat very much sugar, and so a lot of the substance is salt. I mean, we shouldn't be eating much salt, but it helps to give flavor. And so I'm not sure, that's not really something I can answer with any great...
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. It's a question of, you can have something that's certain to a certain percentage, but it's not, you can never prove it 100%. Theoretically, it's even impossible to prove that something is totally safe. And so the question really is, what can testing look like so that we do have confidence that it's safe?
Well, I like to shift it to labeling. I would rather than answer about testing, which I don't know much about,
Let's
I
talk about
do
labeling.
know more about labeling, which I know when I look at a label, and I've been trained to look at a label since I was a kid, I want to know what's in the product. And I'm very quick to say, oh, trans fats, put it right back on the shelf. I mean, I look at labels all the time. A lot of people don't know how to read labels, and they
Right.
aren't taught to read labels. That's fine. But we have laws. Vermont just passed a law for genetically engineered labeling. It's the first really clean labeling bill in the country. That happened last week. Was it last week or the week before? And then we also had Connecticut and Maine had passed bills. They had triggers, meaning that a couple, 5 other states had to also have labeling, and then they had to have one of them contiguous to the state of Connecticut, and then there had to be a minimum of 20 million people. So I was thinking, wow, the way those bills were passed, it was kind of like saying, in the state of Connecticut, as soon as everybody gets a master's degree, this is going to be enacted. So but Vermont actually came out just recently with a bill that's very clean. It just says if this product contains genetically engineered ingredients, it will be labeled that says, a line on it, on the packaging that says, this product has been produced by genetic engineering.
Now, there was a proposition a couple years ago in 2012 on a ballot, Prop 37, to
Yes.
label genetically engineered foods, and it failed.
Yes, and $47 million were spent by the people that wanted to make sure it failed to scare people about the product safety, or to scare people about lawsuits and higher prices at the cash register. But the truth of the matter is that lost by less than 3 percentage points. So most of the Californians really do want labeling, and 93% of Americans in the United States, by a New York Times poll, want genetically engineered foods labeled. That's
Now,
just
wait
a
second.
simple label.
If it failed by 3 percentage points, how can you say that most Californians want labeling?
Because when people actually they actually did a poll from exit polls. Good question. And when people were leaving, 67% of them that actually walked away from the polls said, you know what, I think I probably should have voted yes on that bill. I really do want labeling. I was confused about how it was worded. So I think a lot of people were very confused. I think it was intentional that they be confused with a little bit of not sure how this language
But the
is.
wording for Prop 37 was created by activists and organizations that wanted to label genetically engineered foods. So if it was
Yeah.
misleading, it was misleading from that direction.
Well, there was a lot going on. I mean, the people that were in the grassroots spent about $9 million to try to, plead their case, and the people that were trying to kill the initiative spent about $47 million. So that's a significant amount more money that they had available to influence
Right.
people.
Sure.
So I just think if these products are safe and they're just as good or better, Why not put a label on the package that says, now, genetically engineered for better safety, more nutrition? I mean, why not proudly put that right on your label? Why not, if it's that good? I mean, they're really pushing this, that they're as good, they're better, they're safe. Great, let's see it.
And now there's a bill in California to do just that?
Yes, it's Senator Noreen Evans is the author of 1381, SB 1381, and it's just made it through the Health Committee, it's made it through the Judiciary Committee, and next Monday, the 12th of April, it's going to be going...
12th of May.
Are we already in May?
I think so.
I think you're right. Okay, so May, we're going to be, it's going to the, which committee is it? It's the Appropriations Committee.
Okay.
And so we're going to see what happens on April, May the 12th.
And what would this
Get
bill
April
do?
in my head. Well, it just, all it is it's saying that the foods that are sold in the state of California that have genetically engineered ingredients just have to have a label, just one line on the back of the package, somewhere on the package that's visible, easy to see, that says that this product it's been produced through genetic engineering. One line.
Or has some ingredient that was produced through genetic engineering?
Yes.
Or derived from genetic engineering sources?
Yes, it's one line that's just explains that there's this has trans fat. You see the trans fats, you see the percentage of trans fat or whatever it might be. So it's just one line on the packaging. And it doesn't apply to animal products, meaning it doesn't apply to,
Meats, dairy? all
meats, dairy. I don't know if it applies to dairy, but it doesn't apply to farmers markets, and it doesn't apply to the farmers themselves. So the farmers are not, well, the farmers, when they're providing the product to the producers, the people that are going to go and make, like, let's say, cakes and cookies or whatever, soups or whatever, they have to let them know if the crop has been genetically engineered or not. But it's the producers putting the package on the label that make sure that they identify the ingredients that will be the ones that have to make sure that that's done correctly. So they have to be sure that their source is correct, and then they have to identify it. But it doesn't apply to liquor. So it really is a pretty simple bill that it really just applies to only really pretty much the packaged foods, because most of these foods we don't buy in a whole form like an apple. We don't have the genetically engineered apples.
Okay, so it doesn't apply to produce, to meat products, to eggs, to possibly dairy, but really packaged foods, canned foods, and so on. So there would be a distinction between, say, a canned vegetable and a vegetable sold fresh.
Well, maybe if it's corn, that's a possibility, but since so few of the vegetables that are canned are actually genetically engineered, it probably wouldn't apply to very many of those, unless there's some other processing involved.
Okay.
Well, let's say creamed
corn
or creamed string beans or
Or they
something.
had some preservative that came from a genetically engineered source.
Yeah, that would be a good example,
Right.
sure. So they just have a very small label that just says, New York is working towards getting a bill passed. So 2 of the biggest states in the country are working on bills right now. New York's got a bill that's just moved out of their Consumer Affairs and Protection Committee. And there's 29 states in the United States working on bills right now to get this passed. And you mentioned earlier the federal bill, there's a bill that was just introduced by Senator Pompeo out of Kansas that is designed to make it illegal or just prohibit any state from having any labeling laws that ever get enacted in the United States. So it's important that we understand this is about anybody who eats food is putting something in their body that they're trusting is what they think is safe for them. And if they feel that they're not sure about that and they want to identify, like if I didn't have, let's say I'm a diabetic, I didn't know about the salt content in my product because they didn't have it on the label. I could be ingesting things without knowing that could be very damaging to my body. We just want a label so that we can identify what it is we decide that we're going to eat or not. I mean, if I go into a store and I see cosmetics that have things in it that I can't understand, I don't know what that word is, probably a lot of them are because a lot of them are made out of chemicals that I don't know anything about, I'd be careful about putting them on my skin or putting them in my hair. So the same thing I think is true for anything we ingest. We just need to be able to be informed about it. And that's what we're about in America, to identify things, to stand up for our rights. I think we don't have the right to see whether or not we're eating a genetically engineered food unless we know the ones that aren't, and we know that we're eating those, which is good. And another thing too, we do have organics, which are available, and we do have the conventional crops which are available that are, they're whole foods. But not everybody can afford organic food.
Right.
I know I can't always afford organic food.
It tends to be more expensive.
It tends to be a little more expensive. So for people who don't have fresh food available to them very frequently, or they have to go long distances for it, or they don't have transportation to get to it, or they don't have a farmer's market or a garden, these are really big issues, because people who don't have access to great choices other than processed foods, they're the most vulnerable. So they need to be able to at least go to a processed food and say, oh, okay, this one's not genetically engineered, this one is, I can make my choice. I mean, that's all it really is.
But even in those processed foods, if there is a labeling requirement, suppose that one food uses an ingredient that comes from a genetically engineered source and another one doesn't, would you tend to see a price difference between those?
There doesn't seem to be any in the other countries that this is being done in. 64 countries already label these products, so we can just use their labels.
I don't mean the cost of the label itself, but the cost of getting the ingredient from a non-genetically engineered source rather than from a genetically engineered source.
I don't know. I don't know how. I guess that would put the burden on people that want to make sure the product is non-genetically engineered, and so maybe there's a bump in price in some of those products. I guess I've seen that. I think I've seen that some of the non-genetically engineered, when they have the non-GMO project label on them, and the organics tend to be a little more expensive, so maybe they do have to go to a little effort. I know they have to do very stringent protocols in order for them to get the non-GMO label put on their packaging, and also for their organics have to go through stringent guidelines and regulation about how they produce the animals and the crops, so it makes sense that they'd be a little more expensive. So I would actually tend to think if it's labeled that it's been produced through genetic engineering, it's probably not going to be more expensive, but we don't see any indication that there's any extra cost for that.
Thank you very much. Most enjoyable interview.
Very good to be with you.
I think our viewers learned a lot on genetic engineered materials and foods.
Thank you so much, Jack. I'm so glad to have been here. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us. And until next time, good night.